My name is Marilyn, and if anyone had told me that my own child would one day try to end my life, I would have laughed it off as cruel fiction. But tonight, as I sat across from my son and his wife, smiling through the faint bitterness of my evening tea, I realized the truth I had spent years refusing to see. The people I loved most were trying to kill me. It was supposed to be our 40th wedding anniversary, a day filled with laughter, stories, and love. My husband Walter and I had been together since we were barely out of high school. We'd built our home with our own hands, planted every tree in the backyard, and dreamed of growing old together, surrounded by our children and grandchildren. Instead, I sat at the dinner table, staring at a cup of chamomile tea that didn't taste quite right. At first, I thought maybe the sugar had crystallized, or maybe the new tea bags our daughter in law Sophie had brought were just stronger. But there was something else, a metallic aftertaste that clung to the back of my throat. Walter didn't notice. He was too busy smiling proudly at our son, Ethan, who had planned the entire dinner. 40 years, Mom, he said, raising his glass of wine. You and Dad are the reason I know what real love looks like. He was lying. And maybe the worst part was that I still smiled back because a mother's heart, even when it's bleeding, still hopes. I remember that night down to every flicker of candlelight. The table was set beautifully. Sophie always had an eye for presentation. The smell of roasted chicken filled the room, mixed with the faint hint of roses from the vase she'd placed at the center. Everything looked perfect. But perfection, I've learned, is often the mask evil wears. Sophie poured the tea herself, insisting I sit and rest. You've done enough, Mom, she said with that sugary voice that always felt just a little too sweet. Tonight, we take care of you. And she did. Every detail, every dish, every sip. It wasn't until I felt that strange burning in my stomach that the world began to tilt. I placed a trembling hand on the table. Sophie, I said softly, trying to steady my voice. What kind of tea is this? She froze for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for the truth to reveal itself before she smiled again and said, Oh, the usual. Chamomile with a touch of honey. Why? But behind that smile, her eyes didn't move. They were fixed, watchful, waiting. Walter didn't notice the tension. He was telling a story about the first table he ever built for our home, the oak one still sitting in our dining room after 4 decades. Remember, honey? He said, chuckling. You hated that table at first, said the legs were too thick. I forced a laugh, my throat dry. I love that table now, I managed to say, even as my head began to swim. Sophie reached out and touched my shoulder. Are you all right, Mom? Her hand was cold. And that's when I knew something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. I never imagined that family could feel like a trap. But looking back, I see the signs I ignored for years. Ethan was always ambitious, charming, persuasive, and so much like his father when he wanted something. But where Walter's charm came from kindness, Ethan's came from control. He liked to be the one steering every conversation, every plan, every future. When he married Sophie, I told myself it was good for him, that she'd soften his edges. She seemed warm, graceful, the kind of daughter-in-law any mother would pray for. But Sophie was a mirror, reflecting only what you wanted to see. And I saw what I needed to believe, that my son was happy.
6 months before that dinner, Ethan had suggested we update our will. It's just good planning, he said over breakfast one morning. You and Dad aren't getting any younger. Walter laughed, brushing it off, but I remember the way Ethan looked at me, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll make sure everything's handled fairly," he said. "No stress, no confusion later." I should have known then that fairness wasn't what he wanted. When we met with the lawyer, Ethan did most of the talking. He wanted our assets, the house, Walter's woodworking shop, my savings from years of teaching, to go into a trust for family security. He said he'd manage it himself. Sophie just sat beside him, nodding like a well-trained actress. Walter, ever the trusting soul, signed the documents. "It's good to be practical," he said. "Besides, Ethan would never hurt us." But that night, as I washed the dishes, I found myself staring at my own reflection in the kitchen window. Something in my gut whispered, "He already is." 2 weeks before the dinner, Ethan and Sophie began visiting more often, bringing groceries, cleaning the house, fussing over little things like medication schedules and diet. It should have felt loving. It felt clinical, like caretakers preparing for a patient's final days. One afternoon, I overheard them in the living room. Ethan's voice was low, but tense. "It's taking too long," he said. "She's fine one day, dizzy the next. Are you sure about the dosage?" Sophie whispered back something I couldn't make out. Then silence. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. When I walked in a few seconds later, they both smiled. Too quickly. "Oh, Mom, we were just talking about vitamins. I think you should switch brands." Vitamins. If only I had known then how close that lie was to the truth. The first time I got sick was a week before the dinner. I thought it was food poisoning. Sophie had brought over homemade soup that day, a special recipe for energy, she had said. By midnight, I was doubled over in pain. Walter wanted to call an ambulance, but Sophie insisted it wasn't necessary. "She just needs rest," she said over the phone. "I'll drop by some herbal tea tomorrow." She did, and I drank it because I still believed in family. The irony of it all is that the closer we'd got to our anniversary, the more I started feeling tired. My body ached constantly, my vision blurred some nights. Walter blamed age, but deep down, I knew. My instinct screamed that something was wrong, and yet I silenced that voice, because no mother wants to believe her own son would ever wish her harm. That's the kind of denial you can die from. When the anniversary dinner began, I tried to ignore the pit in my stomach. Sophie greeted us at the door in a red dress, the kind she knew Walter always complimented. "Sit down, you two," she said cheerfully. "Ethan's been cooking all day." Cooking? My son? The same son who hadn't made toast without burning it since he was 10? As I took my seat, I noticed Sophie already had the plate set: chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, and 2 steaming cups of tea. Mine was darker than Walter's. I almost switched them. Almost. But then Ethan smiled at me, that same boyish grin that had melted my heart since the day he was born. And I thought, "You're being paranoid, Marilyn. He's your son." So I drank. The dizziness came halfway through dessert. The room started spinning. I heard Walter's voice, distant and muffled, like he was underwater. "Marilyn? Honey, are you all right?" Sophie stood up quickly. "I'll help her to the couch," she said, her tone calm, too calm. She supported me by the arm, guiding me to the living room sofa. "It's okay, Mom. Just relax. Everything's fine." But then she said something that shattered the illusion completely. She thought I couldn't hear her. "Don't panic, Ethan," she whispered to Ethan, her voice low but sharp. "She's reacting faster than last time." Last time? My heart stopped. That's when I realized what the burning in my throat had been for weeks. Not acid reflux, not age, not nerves. It was poison. I lay there on the sofa, pretending to be too weak to move. I heard every word as Ethan hissed back. You said the dosage was safe. If she dies too soon, people will ask questions. Sophie's answer was soft, cold, almost emotionless. It has to look natural. That's the only way we'll get everything without suspicion. That's when Walter walked in and the mask of sweetness returned instantly. She's fine, Sophie said brightly. Just a little dizzy from the wine. Walter looked relieved. I told you not to overdo it, sweetheart. He kissed my forehead, and I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Not yet. Because right then, I understood. If I said a single word, if I accused them without proof, we'd both be dead before morning. So I smiled. I smiled while my body trembled, while my husband's arm rested gently around my shoulders, while my son and his wife toasted to many more happy years, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking like a mother. I was thinking like a survivor. And that night, as the candlelight flickered across their smiling faces, I made myself a silent promise. They think they've poisoned me, but before this is over, I'll make sure they choke on their own lies.
You always did have a way of getting what you want. But some things are best left untouched.
I didn't sleep that night. The walls of our home felt too close, every sound sharper, every breath heavier. I lay beside Walter, pretending to be half asleep, while my mind raced in circles around the same sickening truth. My son was trying to kill me. The man snoring softly beside me had no idea. I turned my head to look at him, his face peaceful in the pale glow from the window. My husband, kind, trusting, simple-hearted Walter, believed we were living the golden years of our marriage. He still thought of Ethan as the boy who carved his Father's Day cards out of popsicle sticks. I couldn't tell him yet. If I did, he'd confront them, and knowing my husband, he'd do it angrily, without proof. And then we'd both end up buried, literally or otherwise. So I did what every desperate mother must. I began to act. The next morning, Sophie arrived early, far too early for a Sunday. She let herself in through the back door, humming softly as if she owned the house. "Morning, Mom," she called out, setting down a grocery bag. "I thought I'd make breakfast. You still look a little pale from last night." Her tone dripped with sugar. I forced a weak smile. "You're so thoughtful, dear. I guess I did overdo it yesterday." She smiled, that closed-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It happens at your age," she said lightly, as though she were commenting on the weather. My age. The word stung more than I expected. Sophie was skilled as subtle cruelty, disguised as kindness. Every comment had an undercurrent, a message only I could hear. "You should really rest more, Marilyn. Maybe let Ethan handle things. He's very responsible." Responsible? The same man who'd been siphoning our savings behind our backs? Walter came into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Smells good in here," he said cheerfully. "What's cooking, Soph?" "Just some oatmeal, eggs, and herbal tea. Something gentle for Marilyn's stomach." My stomach twisted at the mention. I watched as she poured the tea, her movements precise, confident, like someone performing a well-rehearsed act. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. She poured my cup from a separate teapot, not the same one she filled for Walter. It took everything in me not to show my fear. When she turned to place the cups on the table, I accidentally dropped my napkin. As I bent to pick it up, I switched the cups, hers for mine. She didn't notice. Walter reached for the sugar bowl, Ethan walked in yawning, and Sophie sat down with a pleasant sigh, right in front of the cup meant for me. For the next 10 minutes, I kept my face neutral while my heart pounded loud enough to drown out the clinking of cutlery. Then it happened. Sophie's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the cup. She took one small sip, then another. By the third, her face paled just a fraction. She pressed her hand to her chest, forcing a smile that didn't hide her discomfort. "Are you all right, dear?" I asked softly. She blinked, trying to keep composure. "Just a little heartburn. Maybe the tea's too strong," I said gently. She didn't respond, but she didn't finish the cup either. That moment confirmed everything. The poison wasn't a theory, it was real. But instead of feeling relief at being white, a wave of fury rose inside me, cold and shaking. How long had they been doing this? How many times had I smiled, unaware that each sip brought me closer to death? I had been feeding the serpent in my own garden, and I was done pretending not to see its fangs. That afternoon, I visited my sister Hazel, the only person in the world I could trust. She was blunt, skeptical, and fiercely protective. When she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't ask questions, just ushered me in and put on a pot of coffee. I told her everything, every sip of bitter tea, every strange visit, every overheard whisper. She didn't interrupt until I was done. Then she leaned forward, eyes wide and sharp. "Marilyn, if what you're saying is true, you can't stay in that house another night." "I can't leave Walter," I said, my voice breaking. "He has no idea. And if I just disappear, they'll spin a story about me being confused or unstable." Hazel frowned. "Then we get proof. Quietly. You said Ethan handles the bills now, right?" I nodded. "Then that's where we start." The next week became a balancing act between survival and strategy. Ethan dropped by daily, always smiling, always checking in. Sophie played the devoted daughter-in-law, bringing food and supplements I never touched. I learned to fake weakness, coughing when she entered, acting groggy, pretending the poison was working. Each night, when Walter fell asleep, I wrote in a small notebook every symptom, every visit, every suspicious phrase. I hid it inside the hollow of an old sewing box wrapped in plastic. Meanwhile, Hazel worked her quiet magic. She contacted her friend, a retired pharmacist, who agreed to test a few tea samples, hypothetically, of course. I slipped one of Sophie's tea bags into my purse and dropped it off the next day. 2 days later, Hazel called. "Marilyn," she said in a whisper, "it's laced. Not enough to kill instantly, but enough to weaken someone over time." I sat in silence, staring out the window. Outside, Ethan was mowing the lawn, the picture of the dutiful son, and all I could think was, he probably planned my funeral between tax payments. That night, Walter confronted me. "You've been distant lately," he said. "Are you still upset about updating the will? Because Ethan's just trying to help." I took his hands in mine, forcing calm. "Walter, do you remember what I always told our students when they brought excuses for missing homework?" He frowned. "You said the truth doesn't need rehearsing." "Exactly," I whispered. "And lately, our son sounds like a man who's practiced every word." He chuckled softly, trying to ease the tension. "You worry too much, love. They're just trying to take care of us." But his eyes, kind, tired, trusting, reminded me what was truly at stake. He still believed in his son. So I smiled. I let him keep that illusion, because the truth would shatter him too soon. The next morning, Ethan arrived with legal documents. "Just routine updates," he said casually. "It's about the property titles. We're trying to protect you from probate complications." The way he said "protect you" made my skin crawl. Walter signed them immediately, trusting as ever. When Ethan handed me the pen, I hesitated. "I'd like to read them over," I said softly. He frowned, his smile flickering. "Mom, they're just standard papers. You can trust me." "I do," I said, forcing a tremor into my voice. "But old habits die hard. I used to teach reading comprehension, remember?" He laughed, but his eyes hardened. "Sure, Mom. Take your time." When he left, I scanned the papers. They weren't standard. They transferred partial ownership of our home into Ethan's name,
under the guise of financial management. I tore them in half and hid the pieces in the fireplace. Then I began to plan. A few days later, Hazel came over under the pretext of helping me with garden work. While Ethan and Sophie chatted in the kitchen, she slipped a tiny voice recorder into the flower pot by the window. "If they talk while you're out of the room, we'll have proof," she whispered. I nodded, gripping her hand tightly. "If anything happens," she cut me off. "You're not dying, Marilyn, not on their terms." Her words became my anchor. That evening, I staged weakness. I complained of dizziness, clutching my stomach during dinner. Sophie feigned concern while glancing at Ethan. He gave her a quick, silent nod. "Mom, maybe you should start resting more," he said gently. "Sophie can come by daily to help." "That's not necessary," I said quietly. "Walter's all the help I need." Ethan's tone sharpened. "Dad's not getting any younger either. You could fall, hurt yourself. We just want to make sure you're safe." Safe. That word again. Every time he said it, it sounded like a threat.
The following week, Sophie brought another pot of soup. I accepted it with a shaky smile, knowing full well what floated beneath the broth. I ladled a portion into a separate bowl, sealed it, and hid it in the freezer when she left. When Hazel's contact tested it, the results came back the same. Trace amounts of heavy metal compounds, slow-acting toxins. That night, I sat alone on the porch as rain tapped against the roof. The darkness wrapped around me like a warning. My hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. If Ethan had killed me slowly, it would have been ruled natural causes. My son would have stood at my funeral and given a speech about what a wonderful mother I'd been. And the world would have believed him. I couldn't let that happen. The next morning, I began documenting everything digitally. Photos of the tea, the soup, the documents Ethan tried to get me to sign. I uploaded everything to a cloud drive under a fake name Hazel created for me. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was evidence. One night, as Walter and I watched an old movie, Ethan arrived unannounced. He carried a box of medication. "Mom," he said, "the doctor called. We got your test results. Looks like your potassium is low. Sophie picked up supplements for you." My heart froze. "I didn't go to the doctor," I said softly. He blinked, caught off guard for half a second. "Oh, right. I meant Sophie spoke to a friend at the pharmacy. Same difference." He placed the pills on the table, smiling too wide. "Take one every night. They'll help." When they left, I looked up the label online. It didn't exist. Days blurred together. I pretended to grow weaker, leaning into my role. Every groan, every shaky step, all part of the act. Then, one afternoon, I overheard the conversation that changed everything. Ethan thought I was asleep in the next room. Through the half-open door, I heard his low voice. "She's deteriorating faster than expected. Another week, maybe 2. Sophie answered flatly. "Good. The accounts are ready. Once she's gone, we transfer everything. But what about Walter?" Ethan sighed. "We'll say he's grieving. People won't question if he follows soon after." I pressed my fist against my mouth to stop the sob that threatened to escape. They had planned it all, even Walter's death. That night, I told Hazel everything. "You can't wait any longer," she said, voice trembling with urgency. "You have to go to the police." I shook my head. "Not yet. I need one clear confession, something undeniable." "Marilyn, if I go now, they'll spin it as paranoia. I need them to incriminate themselves." Hazel exhaled shakily. "Then you better be damn careful, because they're running out of patience." The next evening, Sophie invited us to dinner at their house. "Just a small family night," she said sweetly, "to cheer you up." I knew better. When I looked at her eyes, there was no warmth left, just calculation. That dinner, I realized, would be the night they'd finish what they started. So I prepared. Before we left, I hid a voice recorder in my handbag and tucked a small camera, one of Hazel's, into my sweater pocket. If I was going to die, I'd make sure the truth didn't die with me. As we walked toward the car that evening, Walter held my hand. "You look pale, love.
Maybe we should stay home. I smiled faintly. No, darling, I think it's time we saw our children. He didn't hear the tremor in my voice, because deep down, I already knew. This dinner wasn't about family. It was about survival. And I wasn't planning to be their victim anymore.
The drive to Ethan and Sophie's house felt longer than usual. Every streetlight flashed over Walter's worried face, and I couldn't tell if he was nervous for me or simply exhausted by all the tension I'd been pretending not to notice. I stared out the window, gripping the edge of my purse where the recorder hid inside. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was steady now, cold, the rhythm of resolve. They thought they were leading me into a quiet farewell dinner, but I was the one walking them into a confession. Sophie greeted us at the door, smiling too brightly, her voice a little too high. Come in, come in. I made your favorite, mushroom stew. I felt my stomach twist at the word mushroom. Poisonous meals had become her signature. Walter beamed as though it were any other evening. Smells wonderful, sweetheart, he said, hanging up his coat. He gave me a look that said, see, everything's fine. But nothing about that house felt fine. The air inside was different. Sweet, almost floral, like too much air freshener trying to mask something else. The curtains were drawn, and the lighting was dim. On the table, 2 wine glasses glimmered beside a crystal bottle of red. Only 2, for me and Walter. Where's yours? I asked, forcing a smile. Sophie blinked. Oh, I'll just have water. I'm still not feeling great from the other night. Her excuse almost made me laugh. Ethan joined us, rolling up his sleeves and placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. Let's eat before it gets cold, he said cheerfully. He pulled out my chair like a gentleman. The same chair, I noticed, that gave me a direct view of the living room camera above the mantel. They'd recently installed it for security, but tonight it pointed straight at the table for documentation, I realized. In their version of the story, there'd be footage of an elderly couple enjoying dinner and collapsing moments later from a tragic stroke. Except this time, they weren't the only ones recording. I placed my handbag beside my chair, carefully angling it toward them so the tiny red light hid inside would catch every word. Sophie poured the wine, humming softly, her hands perfectly steady. That alone scared me. It meant she'd done this before. Ethan raised his glass. To family, he said. Walter smiled and lifted his. To family. I hesitated, then lifted mine too. But when I drank, I only let the liquid touch my lips. Years as a teacher taught me a simple trick. Press your tongue against the rim and tilt slightly. It looks convincing, but you swallow nothing. Sophie watched me the entire time. I caught her reflection in the glass. She wasn't smiling anymore. Dinner dragged on painfully. Walter talked about his new wood carving project, completely unaware that he was the only one eating heartily. Sophie nodded and smiled, asking about the details. Ethan, however, seemed distracted, glancing at the clock, checking his phone, tapping his foot. I knew that restlessness. It was the impatience of someone waiting for something to happen. When Walter excused himself to use the restroom, the real show began. Sophie set down her fork. How are you feeling tonight, Marilyn? Her tone had shifted. No warmth, no performance, just cool curiosity. I met her eyes evenly. Better. The dizziness is gone. She tilted her head. That's surprising. Why? Because it usually takes a few days for symptoms to clear. She caught herself too late. What symptoms? I asked quietly. Her smile flickered. Oh, from stress. Of course, stress can be deadly, can't it? For the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes, uncertainty, and I let it linger. When Walter returned, I smiled sweetly and said, You know, Sophie, I think we should have the recipe for this stew. It's delicious. Her jaw tightened. Oh, it's just something I came up with. Nothing special. I leaned back. Well, I'd love to show it to my sister. She's very particular about ingredients. Sophie's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. Hazel's name always did that, because she knew my sister never liked her. She also knew Hazel was the kind of woman who asked too many questions. Ethan quickly jumped in. Let's not talk about Hazel tonight. She's always filling your head with nonsense, Mom. Nonsense? I said softly. You mean like facts, bank records, or doctor reports? His head snapped up. For a second, silence filled the room. Then he laughed, but the sound was hollow. Mom, you've been spending too much time online again. I smiled faintly. Maybe I have. Or maybe I've just started paying attention. After dinner, Sophie offered dessert, chocolate mousse, her special recipe. Walter declined politely, saying he was full. I did too, using the excuse of watching my sugar intake. That seemed to frustrate her. She packed up the leftovers and wrapped the mousse carefully. You can take some home, she said. I smiled, accepting the container. Little did she know, that dessert would soon be sitting in a police lab. When we got home that night, I finally told Walter everything. He sat in stunned silence as I played back the recording from my purse, the clipped words, the thinly veiled threats, the strange comment about symptoms. For a long time, he said nothing. Then his face turned gray. Marilyn, he whispered, you mean to tell me Ethan, our son? Yes. He shook his head, as though trying to wake from a nightmare. No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. I placed a hand on his. We can't afford denial anymore, Walter. They've already started killing us. Slowly. He buried his face in his hands. What do we do? My answer came out colder than I intended. We make them confess. On their own. The next morning, I called Sophie. Sweetheart, I said gently, I've been feeling strange again. Maybe you could stop by later and help me with lunch. There was a short pause. Then, of course, Mom. I'll be there at noon. Perfect. When she arrived, Walter had gone to the hardware store. In truth, he was parked down the street, waiting, his phone camera recording every second. Sophie came in smiling as usual, carrying a thermos. She said, I made your favorite. I nodded, taking it from her hands. You're such a dear. We sat in the kitchen, the recorder hidden under a stack of recipe books. I poured us both cups, pretending to take a sip. Then I looked up. Sophie, can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing this? She froze. Doing what? You know exactly what I mean. Her hand trembled slightly. You're not making sense, Marilyn. You've been confused lately. I cut her off. Stop pretending. I know about the tea, the soup, the pills. I've tested them. Her face drained of color. What are you talking about? I know you're poisoning me, I said, my voice calm. The question is, why? She stared at me, then laughed, high-pitched, forced. That's insane. You're paranoid. Am I? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Because the pharmacist says otherwise. Her mask cracked. I saw the flicker of panic, then the shift, the switch from innocence to calculation. She stood up slowly, crossing her arms. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're losing your mind. I smiled. Then why are you shaking? That's when she snapped. Because you weren't supposed to find out. You were supposed to sleep through it, peacefully. Her hand flew to her mouth, realizing what she'd just said. But it was too late. Every word was on tape. I sat back, my pulse steady. Does Ethan know you're here? She swallowed. He told me to make sure you took your medicine. That's all. Your medicine? You mean my poison? Her silence was the only confirmation I needed. Then she whispered, almost pleading, You don't understand, Marilyn. We didn't have a choice. Ethan's in trouble. He owes. The sound of the front door interrupted her.
Ethan stepped inside, his eyes flicking from me to Sophie. Mom, what's going on here? Nothing. She's confused. She thinks she's not confused, I said firmly. She knows. He stared at me for a long time, his jaw tightening. Then he exhaled through his nose. Well, I guess that makes this easier. He reached into his coat pocket, and for one horrifying second, I thought he had a weapon, but it was just his phone. He set it on the counter and pressed record. Go on, Mom. Tell me what you think you know. I folded my hands, calm. I know you've been poisoning me, slowly, to make it look natural. He smiled. You really think anyone will believe that? You're old, forgetful. Half the time you can't remember where you put your keys. Maybe not. But I do remember which one of us has something to hide. His smirk faded. Then I said the words that sealed his fate. The police already have copies of my recordings. They're just waiting for one more. Your confession. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. He turned to Sophie. What did you say? She tricked me, Sophie stammered. I didn't mean to. You idiot, Ethan shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. You couldn't keep your mouth shut for 5 minutes? His voice shook the room. Then he turned back to me, his calm mask gone. You think you can ruin me? No, I said softly. You already did that yourself. I reached for my purse, pressing the hidden button on my phone. Say hello to Detective Ross. He's listening right now. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Sophie, realization dawning too late. She's wired. The front door burst open. Walter stepped inside, not alone this time, but flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Ethan Carter, you're under arrest for attempted murder. The sound of metal cuffs clicking echoed through the kitchen. Sophie sobbed as another officer read her rights. Ethan's face twisted with disbelief. You set me up, he hissed. No, I whispered. I simply stopped pretending to be your victim. As they led them away, I sat down at the kitchen table. My body trembled, but not from weakness, from release. Walter came to my side, his eyes glassy. Marilyn, you planned all this? I nodded slowly. They thought I was dying, Walter, but I was just waiting for them to show their true faces. He took my hand and held it tight. You're stronger than I ever knew. Not stronger, just finally awake. Outside, red and blue lights flashed against the dark windows. The neighbors would whisper about it for weeks. The perfect son, the lovely daughter-in-law, arrested for trying to poison their parents. But what they wouldn't know is how close death had already come to our door. How many quiet meals and gentle smiles had been loaded with murder. As I watched the police cars disappear down the street, one thought lingered in my mind. They tried to bury me with poison, but all they did was feed the fire.
It's finally over.
The morning after the arrest, I woke to silence. For months, every sound in this house, the creak of the hallway floorboards, the clink of dishes, the hum of Sophie's fake laughter, had felt heavy with danger. But now, that same silence felt clean, peaceful. Walter sat beside me at the breakfast table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. His face looked older somehow, maybe from shock, maybe from grief. They're saying Ethan confessed, he murmured, not looking up. Said it was Sophie's idea, that he didn't mean for it to go that far. I nodded quietly. And Sophie said it was all his fault, didn't she? He gave a broken laugh. Exactly. They're already turning on each other. It was strange. The relief I expected never came. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't bring joy. It brings exhaustion, a hollow kind of calm, like the quiet after a storm that's taken half your world with it. Still, I was alive, and that, I reminded myself, was victory enough. The investigation unfolded quickly. The police had everything: recordings, tainted food samples, forged financial papers. Ethan's voice was clear on the tape. It has to look natural. That's the only way we'll get everything without suspicion. Sophie's confession followed within days. She'd done the research, ordered the toxins online, disguised them as vitamins. They'd both planned it for nearly a year. I should have felt hatred. Instead, I felt pity, because beneath their greed was something even sadder: emptiness, the kind that eats people from the inside out until they can't tell love from possession. A few weeks later, the trial began. The courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, two scents that, for some reason, reminded me of my years as a teacher. I sat in the witness stand, hands folded in my lap, staring at the son I'd once cradled in my arms. Ethan wouldn't look at me. His face was pale, his suit slightly too large, as though he'd shrunk inside it. Sophie sat beside him, her hair pulled back, her eyes red from crying. Their lawyer tried to paint it as caregiver burnout, that they hadn't meant to harm us, only to help manage our lives. But when the prosecutor played the recordings, the courtroom fell silent. The sound of Sophie's voice, cold, practical, saying, "Don't panic. She's reacting faster than last time." The gasp that rippled through the room made my hands tremble. Then Ethan's voice, "You said the dosage was safe." Walter closed his eyes beside me. I watched his shoulders shake, not from anger, but from heartbreak. The verdict came after 2 weeks. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. They were sentenced to 20 years in prison. As the judge read the decision, Sophie burst into tears. Ethan just sat there, staring at the floor. The same boy who once made me paper flowers on Mother's Day, now unable to even meet my eyes. And that's when the tears came, not for what they did, but for what was lost long before that dinner. The son I'd raised, the family I'd believed in, those had died long before the poison ever touched my lips. After the sentencing, Detective Ross walked me to the courthouse steps. "Most people in your position wouldn't have survived that long," he said quietly. "You're lucky you trusted your instincts." "Instinct," I murmured, "or heartbreak. Sometimes they feel the same." He smiled sadly. "You ever think about writing this all down? Might help others recognize the signs." I thought about it. Maybe I still will. But right then, I just wanted to go home. To the house that, despite everything, still smelled faintly of cinnamon and sawdust, the way Walter liked it. That first night back, I couldn't sleep. I stood in the kitchen, the same place Sophie used to stand while she stirred my tea, and I looked at the teapot still sitting on the counter. I picked it up, hesitated, then dropped it into the trash. Some ghosts don't deserve to stay. Walter joined me a moment later. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, resting his chin on my head. "We'll be okay," he said softly. I nodded. "Eventually." He smiled faintly. "You always were the strong one, you know." "Maybe, but strength isn't what saved us. Paying attention did." In the months that followed, neighbors came by often, some with casseroles, others with questions they were too polite to ask directly. I gave them all the same answer. Evil doesn't always look like strangers. Sometimes it looks like family, smiling at your table. I didn't mean it bitterly, just honestly. Because what I learned through all this wasn't about hate. It was about blindness, the kind that love can cause. I'd ignored the small things, the impatience in Ethan's voice, the way Sophie corrected my decisions, the subtle push for trust. If I'd listened to my gut sooner, maybe none of this would have happened. But mothers are experts at giving the benefit of the doubt. It's how we're wired, to forgive first, to doubt ourselves second. A year later, I visited them both in prison. I needed to, not for closure, but for clarity. Sophie refused to see me, but Ethan agreed. When they let him into the visitor's room, he looked thinner, older. He tried to smile.
Mom, you look good. I studied him for a long moment. You don't. He dropped his gaze. I'm sorry. The words hung between us, hollow and uncertain. For what? I asked softly. For poisoning me or for getting caught? He swallowed hard, tears welling. I don't know anymore. I sighed. That's the problem, Ethan. You never did. For a moment, the boy I remembered flickered in his eyes. The one who used to run through the garden barefoot, who'd promised me he'd grow up to make you proud, Mom. I felt my throat tighten. I did love you, I whispered. And maybe that's what blinded me the most. He didn't answer. When I stood to leave, I said one last thing, not out of cruelty, but truth. Love without respect isn't love, it's ownership. And you tried to own me, my life, my death, my story. But that ended the day I stopped drinking your tea. Then I walked out, leaving him staring through the glass, his reflection fainting behind me. These days, Walter and I live quietly. We tend the garden, we drink only from one teapot, our own, and sometimes we laugh about how strange life is. We even kept the old anniversary photos Sophie took that night, not as a memory of betrayal, but as a reminder even the darkest nights can end in light if you're willing to open your eyes. I still talk to Ethan in my prayers, not as a murderer, but as a lost soul I once called son, because hate keeps you poisoned long after the cup is empty. Forgiveness, though, forgiveness is the antidote. And every morning, when the sun hits the kitchen window just right, I whisper to myself, not in bitterness, but in peace. They tried to end my story, but I chose to write a new one.